Senators are scheduled to debate the fiscal 2001 budgets for the Labor, Health, and Education departments. Now a House Government Reform Subcommittee oversight hearing on the 2000 census. Among the witnesses, U.S. Census Director Kenneth Pruitt. The hearing is chaired by Congressman Dan Miller, a Florida Republican. It's about 2.5 hours.
Good morning. A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. Last night, the subcommittee was notified that the Bureau had a 3-minute video regarding the census that they would like to air. And before we get started, I would like to go ahead and play the videotape for our viewing audience. So if we'll proceed. Have you seen it?
Rock and roll.
We count.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
I want to be short of that deaf and hard of hearing people. Count it.
Everybody needs to get counted.
They're going fast. Take some pencils there. Don't take all of them. There you go. Buckers for you.
Big job.
Televisión News.
This is the technology. It's a pen.
It's very critical that we have the best and most accurate count possible.
No es demasiado tarde para enviar el formulario del censo.
Makes it very local.
And St. Louis or Tallahassee or Long Beach or who knows where.
We want the country to be excited about the census. This year's Census 2000 form.
Behind all those numbers, there are real lives and real life stories. And when you put them all together, you see the patterns emerge. This is a profoundly important issue if we want to make good decisions about where we're going. We first have to know exactly who we are.
That's very enjoyable. Thank you. It's interesting to see that. It highlights a lot of the really successful outreach that's taken place throughout the country in an enjoyable manner. So we'll proceed with my opening statement, then Ms. Maloney's and Mr. Davis, whoever, and other members join us. The operations of the full enumeration census, as mandated by the Supreme Court, are coming to a close. The non-response follow-up, the most complex part of the full enumeration, is near the end. The hard work of the enumerators has not gone unnoticed by this chairman or this Congress. They are to be commended for their hard work and civic duty in helping count America. And I know I speak for all the members of the subcommittee and, in fact, Congress when I say our condolences go out to all the friends, family, and loved ones of those who have lost their lives in the civic service of our nation. Director Pruitt, you have called the full enumeration the good census. I hope it is the good census. And I hope, in fact, I hope it is the better census. But I do have some concerns. My concerns are that it may prove to be the rushed census. On numerous occasions in the past couple of weeks, concerned Census Bureau employees have contacted my office, some at a managerial level. They were all concerned with one point: quality. They all expressed a feeling of tremendous pressure to finish ahead of schedule. Now, there is nothing fundamentally wrong with finishing ahead of schedule, but if quality is being sacrificed, there is. One local census office manager, still currently employed, said the pressure was too great from the regional office, that the regions were in such fierce competition with each other that it was putting unwarranted pressure on the local census offices. In your testimony, you spoke of a June 15 deadline, an internal cutoff date for non-response follow-up. An internal date of June 15 gives me concern for the following reasons. In interviews conducted by the subcommittee in the Los Angeles region, we found that the regional deadline was June 10. This is almost a month ahead of the public deadline of July 7 and a week ahead of the internal headquarters deadline of June 15. It's easy to see how this rush to complete the work can spiral out of control as one region attempts to finish ahead of another. For the benefit of our viewing audience, the Census Bureau has divided the nation into 12 regions. Director Pruitt, you have assured us that your enumerators would take the time necessary to get a complete and accurate count, even if it meant staying in the field beyond July 7. It doesn't seem to me this is happening. Unless the undercount has been eliminated, why are people pulling out of the field before July 7? You are ahead of schedule and under budget, so why leave the field? We would expect to hear complaints of rushed enumerations in the closing days of non-response follow-up, not weeks before your self-imposed public deadline. In Florida, at the Hialeah Census Office, they finished a non-response workload of 82,000 households in 22 days. That is extraordinarily fast. However, it seemed that no red flags were raised at the regional level. To the contrary, the workers were rewarded by being sent to another office that had yet to complete its workload. Whistleblowers at other LCOs wrote a letter to Congresswoman Carrie, at this other LCO, wrote a letter to Congresswoman Carrie Meek, which resulted in an investigation by the Inspector General. The Inspector General investigation determined that, in fact, there were improper enumerations going on by the Hialeah team. They also determined that the Hialeah office had all along been getting third-party interviews far too quickly and clearly violating established Census Bureau procedures. The investigation also determined that the manager of the Hialeah office had instructed his enumerators to take shortcuts. The situation is so bad that there is consideration that the entire Hialeah workload may need to be redone. It is also my understanding that so far no disciplinary action has been taken against the manager or his immediate supervisors. I hope I'm wrong. None of your quality control procedures caught this problem, not your area manager or regional technician. How many Hialeahs are there out there? I can tell you that the Inspector General is concerned about quality. We are concerned about quality. How many Hialeahs are there out there? According to your records, 46 LCOs completed more than 15% of their workload in the 6th week of non-response follow-up. Some of them claim more than 20,000 visits in a single week. How many of those 46 cut corners to make the June deadline? Last week, the Commerce Secretary announced a half-hearted attempt to remove politics from the census, a regulation that would give full, unreviewable authority to the director of the Census Bureau, the decision on whether or not to release the adjusted census numbers. The announcement would have made more sense coming on April Fool's Day than in June. The transferring of decision-making authority from the Commerce Secretary to the Census Bureau director doesn't make the decision to release manipulated numbers any more palatable or less political. Dr. Pruitt, you are, after all, a political appointee. Political appointees are appointed to the position because they have beliefs that are fundamentally the same as the president's and to carry out the president's agenda. As you have said yourself, unlike the example of the FBI director, you serve at the pleasure of the president. Are we to believe that this president and this Commerce Secretary put forth a candidate that didn't support their positions on the use of adjusted numbers? I remind everyone that Secretary Daley is leaving the Commerce Department to help Al Gore's failing presidential campaign. This decision was political from the very beginning. This proposed regulation isn't about accuracy or nonpartisanship. It's about presidential politics. It's all about trying to raise the stakes for Governor Bush. My colleague from New York called it a Kodak moment. What amazed me about that quote was her candor in acknowledging that the next president would in fact be Governor Bush. These are desperate times for my Democratic colleagues, so it doesn't surprise me that they would attempt to stack the deck before Inauguration Day. This proposed regulation is fundamentally flawed. In fact, I have here with me a legal opinion from the Congressional Research Service which states the following, and I ask unanimous consent included in the record. Quote, although the Secretary may delegate the tasks associated with the decision to the Director, Congress has delegated the authority to him, and he cannot purport to divest himself of the final decision-making responsibility, unquote. What you're trying to do is usurp the authority of Congress to violate the law, plain and simple. Of course, this isn't the first time that this administration has attempted to violate the law regarding the census, and I suspect it won't be the last. Is there nothing that this administration won't do to get the illegal census it wants? And all this effort to have your final plan thrown out by the courts anyway. It really is amazing. Furthermore, I outright reject the notion that the Census Bureau is capable of carrying out a self-audit. I know that the employees of the Bureau are sensitive to my comments, but this isn't a condemnation of their character, rather it is a realization of human nature. Look at this from a business model. I'm sure many people in here own stock in a corporation, and when you look to analyze the financial health or chances of success of a new business venture for that same corporation, where do you look? You look to an independent auditor or an independent analyst. Well, the American people are the shareholders, and the Census Bureau is their corporation. A self-audit is simply unacceptable business practice. Director Pruitt, surrounding yourself with 13 or 30 Bureau professionals doesn't get us to independent analyses. Many of these people have invested the past few years of their life developing the plan. I don't have confidence for them to get to the brink of fruition of their arduous labor and objectively pull back if that's what's needed. No one should be put in that position, and no objective executive would accept such a self-audit. Self-audits lead to failure. We need to look no further than what's currently going on in Los Alamos. The Secretary of Energy rejected an independent security review. He said the department was capable of correcting the failures. Outsiders were not needed. What transpired was a breach of security of such enormous proportions, we still do not know of all the ramifications. Self-audits lead to failure. As you've testified, even the National Academy of Sciences or other statistical groups or universities will not have time to analyze ACE or the sampling plan before it's released to the states. In your opening statement, you talk about this being the most transparent census ever, and you talk about the public scrutiny. What public scrutiny is there going to be of the adjusted numbers before they're released? I'll tell you, there's none. No independent review, no scientific study, just a group of Census Bureau insiders advising you. This is not public scrutiny. It's a whitewash. Any state that accepts these numbers is playing roulette with their redistricting plans. And I just read how the Department of Justice is going to fight having the courts rule on this. We all know this is going to ultimately be decided at the Supreme Court. And I feel very confident the Supreme Court is going to rule adjusted numbers cannot be used. And the sooner the Supreme Court rules, the better it is for everybody concerned. And I'm absolutely amazed and shocked that the Department of Justice is going to fight the courts from ruling sooner than later. That's amazing. I also firmly believe there is reason to be concerned when the administration divests itself of the ultimate responsibility for the certification of these numbers. While I admire your willingness to take this decision on yourself or for your successor, this is a cabinet-level decision. Someone at the cabinet level needs to be responsible for the mess that's going to be caused from releasing two sets of numbers. This administration, which is notorious for not taking responsibility for anything that's bad, must be held accountable, in this case, to the highest levels. Not only is the plan put forth by the Secretary a violation of federal law, on its face, it doesn't stand up to reasonable scrutiny. Ms. Maloney, an opening statement.
Well, Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, but I really don't understand what will make you happy. I get the feeling that if they were slow and not fulfilling the timetable, you would call it a, quote, failed census because they were not meeting the deadline. Now that they're meeting the deadline, you're calling it a rushed census. And I want to say that the census is about people. It's not about politics. It's about making sure that everyone in America is counted. And I must respond to your political statements in your opening statement. I certainly do not believe that Governor Bush will be president for a number of reasons, which I will not go into. But since we are at a census hearing, I will go into a census reason. And that reason, which I was referring to, is that he will not come forward and say that he supports adjusting for the undercount, which we know we missed 13 million people in 1990, and if we don't adjust for the undercount, we'll miss even more. So for a whole host of reasons, which I'd love to tell you about, would take several hours, I can tell you he is not going to be president, but one of them is that he will not count adequately minorities, blacks, Latinos, Asians, American Indians, and the poor in the rural areas and the urban areas, which the scientists have told us are undercounted. Not the politicians, the scientists, and we have 4 independent reports that tell us that. Welcome, Dr. Pruitt. And first of all, Dr. Pruitt, I want to thank you for really the outstanding job that I believe you and the professional staff at the Census Bureau has done so far. Everything I've heard and read indicates that the 2000 census is well on the way to being a great operational success. Despite the cautious stance you've taken, I truly do believe that the 2000 census may well be the best, fairest, and most accurate census ever, a very fitting way to start the 21st century. It will be that way not just because of the operational successes we've seen to date, but ultimately because it incorporates modern scientific methods into the design. The census is now in the final weeks of the non-response follow-up operation. It seems to me to be about 2 weeks ahead of schedule, but will certainly end on time. This success must be added to many others, but to 2 major ones in my opinion. And I would say, number 1, achieving a 65% mail-back response rate, and this reversed 3 decades of a downward trend in response rate. Congratulations to you and the department and all the professionals in the field. And also recruiting and hiring all the personnel you needed to do the massive job that you've done, especially during this time of economic expansion when there is such low unemployment. I must tell you, I was truly amazed that you were able to hire so many people on a short-time basis for this project. Mr. Chairman, I'm sure the director agrees that these successes would have been next to impossible without the full funding provided by Congress for the Census 2000, and I commend you again, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership role in achieving this. Thank you very, very much. I also want to strongly commend Secretary Daley for last week's announcement that he is delegating to the Census Bureau Director the decision about whether or not to release corrected numbers next spring. I believe the Secretary has wisely decided to take the politics out of this decision by leaving it up to the professionals at the Census Bureau, the professionals with the statistical and operational expertise to make what is ultimately a technical, scientific, and operational decision, and to make it in an open and way in the full light of day. I want to especially note Mr. Ryan's supportive comments and would hope that more members would speak out and be supportive of this action as he has. I was particularly happy to hear that not only former Director Ritchie under President Clinton, but also Director Bryant under President Bush supported this action. But also the former director under the Nixon and Carter administrations, the Census Director Vincent Barababa, who in fact had that authority under President Carter, all have joined in supporting this decision by Secretary Daley. I only hope that the rule will go into effect and will be in the process by which the census makes its decisions next year. Mr. Chairman, I also believe that the Census Bureau should be more insulated from political pressures than is currently this case, and I believe from your opening statements that you feel the same way. The census should be about accuracy and the best possible data. It should be protected as far as possible from non-scientific influences. To further that end, I am drafting legislation and hope to have it in before Congress before the end of the week, which would require the Census Bureau Director to serve for a defined term, possibly 5 years. He or she would continue to be presidentially appointed and confirmed by the Senate. In this way, the director could be protected from any political influences from either the Congress or presidential elections. I would welcome the chairman's input and co-sponsorship of this legislation. It should truly be bipartisan, and it would achieve a goal that you mentioned, removing the Census Department completely from politics with a set term. Frankly, Dr. Pruitt, if I could figure out a way to do this, and I mean this sincerely, I would make you director for life. I think you have done a truly outstanding job, even though, as you testified, 30% of your time is responding to requests from Congress. You're ahead of schedule. You've done a great job, but I don't think your family would approve of that. But I think you've done a wonderful job, and I want to thank you on behalf of many Americans who appreciate the hard work of you and your department. Although it seems like the decennial is on its way to an unmitigated success, I have real concerns regarding the funding for non-decennial activities contained in the Census Bureau funding in the House version of Commerce Justice State Appropriations Act, which is due to come to the floor this week. The bill as drafted is $51 million below the administration's request for the census. These cuts could have a devastating effect on America's ability to produce basic economic and demographic information critical to Congress as it attempts to address the issues and policy choices of the 21st century. Inadequate funding will hinder our nation's ability to track our dynamic economy. Measures of business economic activity, such as the gross domestic product, the index of industrial production, the consumer price index, and the producer price index, measures of population economic well-being such as employment and unemployment, health insurance coverage, employment of the disabled, and child care. I would ask unanimous consent that we put into the record a fact sheet prepared by the census which outlines these problems and what would happen with this lack of funding. I was particularly distressed to hear that funding to fix the working conditions at Suitland, with a building that seems prone to floods, asbestos, bad weather, and pigeon problems, that desperately needs renovation, was not included in the budget request. And as I am sure the chairman will agree, the $5 million that, for the unfulfilled request for the American Community Survey is a truly serious problem if we're going to look for alternatives to the long form that was so controversial. Many members of the Senate and House raising objections to it, so we truly do need to add that $5 million for the American Community Survey. I ask, Mr. Chairman, that you join with me in expressing concern about this level of funding. I hope that these cuts can be rescinded before we get to a final bill, and will urge my colleagues to do what they can to that end. No one can dispute that even a few months ago, the idea that we would be almost done with non-response follow-up ahead of schedule is truly an amazing result. And not only the career staff, but the thousands of Americans who worked at the census and cooperated with the census, who answered their nation's call, should be commended. We have all heard stories of hard work and dedication of the staff, and even regrettably, the stories of individual Americans who have in essence died in the line of duty, without whose efforts we could not be looking at such a good census. I would like to close by paying tribute to Miss Dorothy Stewart, a 71-year-old census taker who died under tragic circumstances on June 10th. My deepest condolences go to her family and friends, and I am sure that every member of Congress joins me in expressing our sadness. Thank you very much, and Director Pruitt, I look forward to your comments.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all commend you for holding this census oversight hearing to examine the status of non-response follow-up and closeout procedures. I'd also like to thank Dr. Pruitt for taking his time to come and share with us today regarding the progress of the 2000 census. It also provides me an opportunity to commend the Census Bureau's work thus far, including the leadership provided by the Secretary of Commerce, who has gone to work directly for the next President of the United States. It is good news for America that 98% of the non-response follow-up workload has indeed been completed. As the Census Bureau is entering the final phase of its work, I'm interested to hear how the Bureau is handling the closeout procedures for non-response follow-up and other current operations. In addition, I'm also interested to hear challenges that are facing the Bureau in securing an accurate count of the population. As we all know, census data are crucial for America. Census data will be used to determine future funding for schools, hospitals, road construction, and other programs that will affect local communities. In addition, this data will be used for congressional apportionment and to determine boundaries for state legislative and congressional districts. Thus, accurate census data is crucial for an equal and prosperous America. I've been close to the process, especially in Chicago, and I am concerned about Chicago. It is my understanding that we had been trailing behind the national average of census responses initially. However, I'm pleased to note that with cooperation of the local census centers, the mayor of Chicago, and other elected officials and community leaders, there has been a tremendous improvement and great change. However, even as that improvement has occurred, it has reinforced for me that it is impossible to get an accurate count without some numerical adjustment of the numbers. I have seen instances, Mr. Director, as you know, where every effort has been put forth in certain kinds of communities and certain kinds of neighborhoods. And yet, after all is done, there are still individuals who either refused to complete the form, or individuals who, no matter how many times you go looking for them, they cannot be found. And these are the individuals who, in many instances, have the greatest need of the resources that would be allocated on the basis of the numbers. And so this effort has heightened for me the reality that unless there is adjustment, there can be no absolute fairness. We need to have a complete count of Chicago and all of America, and there is still much work to be done. So I look forward to hearing the comments from Dr. Pruitt as we look at especially how we're making absolute certain that those individuals who reside in areas of high poverty, areas with high immigrant populations, areas with large numbers of people who are homeless, helpless, and hopeless, large numbers of people who have become cynical and who have been left out but need to be cut in. I shall be particularly interested in the efforts that have been made and we're making to make sure that this population group is in fact counted. Again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Pruitt, for coming, and look forward to your testimony.
Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly to Ms. Maloney and my colleague, Mr. Davis, and other members. Welcome again, Director, and I apologize I was not here for your last visit. Pleased to announce that we in Tennessee have certainly been working hard across the state. Our regional office, Ms. Hardy and others have cooperated with all of us across the state. I've worked with Democrats and Republicans, my colleague Jimmy Duncan from the Knoxville area, I and Mayor Ash, Victor Ash. Both Republicans work closely together along with members of their city council and county commission and school board. Was in Nashville with my colleague Bob Clement, the mayor of that great city, Bill Purcell, and we've done things obviously in my district in Memphis. We believe we're making progress and hope that now that our numbers will maintain or continue to be above the national average, and we applaud the good work that you're doing. I mention that only to say that the bipartisanship that pervades back in Tennessee, I would only hope that it would perhaps pass off a little bit to here in Washington, and I would hope at some point that this committee would offer an apology to you, sir, for attacking your integrity during this last hearing and suggesting that perhaps there was, well, casting aspersions on your character rather, but suggesting in some way that you might have had something to do with something that happened out in your San Diego office, which all of us have castigated and all of us have suggested in very strong terms we disagree with and would hope and have been assured that that matter has been taken care of. So I look forward to hearing your comments this morning. I recognize this is the most expensive and labor-intensive aspect of the census count. I'm pleased to hear that we're ahead of schedule, but interested in knowing what more we can do here in this Congress on both sides of the aisle to assist you and to assist all that work with you. But I say thank you up to this point for cooperating with this committee so much and coming before this committee at any and all times that we've asked. And again, we look forward to hearing from your testimony today. And with that, I yield back to the chairman.
Mr. Ford, let me just correct something. I don't think anybody was questioning the integrity of the director of the Census Bureau with respect to the California problem out there. There was a problem in California, but it certainly it was not. The director was, I don't think, was ever suggested was directly involved in anything to do with that issue. But there is a legitimate concern when the General Accounting Office was investigating it.
No, sir, I understand it, Mr. Chairman. I didn't mean to direct that at you or anyone on your staff, but I do know that passions were high that day. And one certainly could have construed from the news reports and accounts that perhaps the director, I'm pleased to hear you say that, and I'm assured that is not the case, but I know I read the director's comments, and I wanted him to be assured that this committee, those of us on this side, and I think I speak for those on the other side as well, certainly did not mean for that to come across or for anyone to interpret it that way. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your
I would think Director Pruitt will acknowledge that that was never a question of his own integrity. There was a legitimate concern. Director Pruitt, I believe you want Mr. Thompson, Mr. Raines to be sworn in at the same time in case they're needed. If all three of you gentlemen would stand and raise your right hand and repeat after me. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record acknowledge that they have answered in the affirmative. Director Pruitt, you now have an opening statement.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can make it very brief. However, I would like to preface it with a comment about Congresswoman Maloney's suggestion that perhaps I could be appointed for life. My wife would agree to that if that would be a bipartisan resolution. So if you can get the chairman to agree to that, why then we'll proceed. I do also want to thank you for showing the video because it does help explain why I believe, at least at this stage, we've been emboldened to label this a good census. A good census is not a perfect census. A good census doesn't mean that there aren't loose ends, but nevertheless, across the large system that has been the decennial census, we do feel obviously quite confident about what's been accomplished thus far. As we know, hiring was a challenge. We did hire and retain sufficient staff to complete every field operation thus far. Paying staff on time was a challenge. Mr. Chairman, we have had a total of 920,000 different individuals move through the census process in the last several months. And we have no complaints about payroll. And that's a very complicated set of operations to make happen. And again, we're using temporary employees to run a very complicated system for other temporary employees, people working a few days in and out and so forth. That 920,000 people moved through our system in the last several months. And we're very pleased that we had no major payroll or administrative problems. Obviously, completing every field operation on schedule was a challenge, but we have completed on or near schedule every one of our field operations. There was a risk, as we all know, of an unexpectedly low mail response rate, and there we exceeded expectations. There were concerns about how well the Census Bureau's data capture system would work. Again, we exceeded expectations. And there was a question about whether the Census Bureau's program to provide questionnaire assistance and multiple response options would work, and they did. And as we entered the non-response follow-up operation about 2 months ago, the Bureau obviously faced its most serious operational challenges. Would we have enough staff, and would they be highly productive? Would the public cooperate? The great success that the Census Bureau has had in non-response follow-up operation is due, obviously, to the dedication, enthusiasm, and resourcefulness of the census workers, and to the fact that the vast majority of Americans did step up and do their duty.
I think we have a vote on the rule, and so I think hopefully we can have time to go ahead and complete your statement, and then we'll recess for a quick one single vote.
While we are pleased with progress thus far, there remain several operations that will improve what is already a good census. I have said numerous times that any national statistic, certainly including the census count, is an estimate of the truth. The challenge is to get that estimate as close to the truth as possible. That is, there is a true count of the resident population of the United States on April 1st, 2000. Were we to conclude the census with the completion of non-response follow-up, we would provide an estimate of that true count. It is unlikely that that estimate would be absolutely accurate, that is identical with the true count. We believe we can move that estimate progressively closer to the truth. And we will therefore continue with 3 other major operations now that we're practically finished with non-response follow-up. Indeed, well, I'll talk about that later. The coverage edit follow-up is one of those operations. It does so by reconciling population count discrepancies. Then there is an operation called coverage improvement, which does so by enumerating housing units added to the address list too late to have been included in the initial non-response follow-up operation. And we expect that's a large field operation. We expect to be returning to nearly 10% of the housing units across the country. And then, of course, the accuracy and coverage evaluation, which uses dual system estimation in a procedure that measures the number of persons missed and the number erroneously included in any of the prior census operations. Although we are now moving into other field operations in our local census offices that have completed non-response follow-up, we are committed to fully applying our procedures to account for every remaining address in the local census offices. Daily production levels begin to decrease toward the end of non-response follow-up. Some enumerators complete their easiest cases first, finish the work closest to their homes, or believe that the quicker they finish their assignment, the sooner they would be out of work. In order to bring the operation to closure within the scheduled weeks, we look at areas within each local census office that are lagging, and we implement a procedure known as final attempt. When the area covered by a crew leader has completed 95% of its workload, final attempt begins, and the crew leader consolidates the remaining work and gives it to the most productive and dependable enumerators. You ask in your letter of invitation about any serious problems in any of our offices. With one exception, an LCO in Florida that you have referenced, there are no serious problems that we are aware of across our system. There obviously are a handful of cases where there are procedural deviations in non-response follow-up, and in these instances we are re-interviewing. This happens when an LCO management does not follow final attempt procedures as set forth. Our best estimate at this stage is that not less than 50,000 nor more than 100,000 cases will be required for re-interviewing. That is 1/4 of 1% of the non-response follow-up workload, well within a reasonable tolerance levels for a complicated series of operations that depend upon a temporary workforce. The only serious case is Hialeah, Florida, along with 2 other areas that did use enumerators from Hialeah. As you know, we are re-interviewing the 20% of the non-response follow-up workload that was done by enumerators who, on instruction from the LCO manager, prematurely collected partial data on households. You ask in your opening comments how many Hialeahs are out there, and obviously we're looking at that, and we can talk about that in the Q&A period. I should say, of course, that the Hialeah case was directly connected to the Elian Gonzalez issue. There aren't a lot of Elian Gonzalez's out there, fortunately, but we were in a community that was in a state of uproar during the period when we went into the field, and that's what led to what turned out to be an abbreviated process. We caught it and have corrected it, and we can talk in detail about it if you wish. And of course, we're also remaining the rest of the work done by the Hialeah enumerators in Hialeah to make sure as an additional quality check, although we think we've now found all 100% of the cases that were treated in that abbreviated fashion. I then quickly return to the earlier discussion about what is a good census. The examples of successes I mentioned relate to two of these, namely operational robustness and a dedication to including everyone in the count. The third element of a good census does involve openness, transparency, and public scrutiny, which can in turn then lead to public trust in the process. We do believe that this has been the most open and transparent census in history. Every detail has been and is being scrutinized, and we welcome that scrutiny. Indeed, as you know, last week, I provided it to you prior to that, but last week at a press conference, we did make public a document entitled Accuracy and Coverage Evaluation that does set forth the rationale, the Census Bureau's preliminary determination that statistically corrected data can be produced within the time frame and will improve the census. And of course, at that same press conference, as you know, Deputy Commerce Department General Counsel Andrew Pincus described the proposed regulation to delegate authority. Just in conclusion then, Mr. Chairman, you made reference to the fact that I was a political appointee. That is true. The director of the Census Bureau is a presidential appointee. So, Mr. Chairman, also as the head of the National Science Foundation, the head of the National Institute of Health, head of NASA. I don't believe, and I doubt that you do, that there is therefore a Republican versus a Democratic way in which NSF funds nanotechnology or particle physics, or NIH conducts its scientific war on cancer or AIDS, or NASA designs an exploration of Mars. I don't think the fact that someone is a presidential appointment makes their activities therefore partisan. And at the Census Bureau, we do not think that there is a way to conduct a Republican versus a Democratic census. We think there are simply ways to try to get the estimate closer to the truth, and that is what we believe we are about. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Pruitt. I think it's time we'll take a quick recess and go vote and come right back, and we'll proceed. We'll proceed. Before I get started asking questions, let me respond to a couple things. Dr. Pruitt, you mentioned you are a political appointee, and there's nothing obviously wrong with it. The head of the National Institute of Health is a political appointee, and obviously very fine people. There's nothing wrong with Ms. Maloney and I are politicians, not originally maybe, but we are politicians. So there's certainly nothing wrong with being a political appointee. The concern I have on the proposal, and we'll talk about that some more, is the need for independent outside review. And there is none that's going to be made or participating in this prior to the decision of March, or whenever the decision is made, February or March of next year. I mean, if you go to the NIH, they have peer review, they have outside, they don't just do it all internal, and this is strictly an internal decision process. Let me also make a response to Congressman Davis and Congressman Maloney talking about the need to count the undercounted, the African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, the rural and urban poor. We all agree we want to do the very best job we can. But we are a nation of laws. And ultimately, we all know this is going to be decided by the Supreme Court, whether we use adjusted numbers. And the sooner we get that decision out of the way, the better off everybody will be concerned. I believe, and I feel the odds are very high, that the Supreme Court is going to say you cannot use adjusted numbers for redistricting purposes. But the court's going to ultimately do that. And to place your blind faith in adjusted numbers is unfortunate because we got to do everything we can to get the best count possible this first full enumeration. Because as I say, I believe that's what the courts are going to say we're going to have to use for redistricting. And that's the reason in my opening statement I believe that we should put all the resources. If we got a little extra money, a little extra time, let's do it. Let's go out and count the undercounted African Americans and the homeless, the rural and urban poor, and all the ones that we know we have a problem with. Let's put those resources into that area. Because, as I say, and I've said it many times, ultimately the Supreme Court's going to decide it, and I feel fairly confident that the court's going to rule that just as they did for apportionment, for redistricting, they're going to have to use the same set of numbers. You can't have two sets of numbers, I don't believe. Let me first talk about the issue of the regulation, this proposed regulation. Who came up with the idea of the regulation, and did the idea originate at the Bureau or the Department of Commerce, or where?
I honestly don't know. It was first of it in a meeting that included myself and Andy Pincus, and I think probably Bill Barron was there. I presume it must have first come from the Commerce Department. It did not, as you recall in my last hearing, Mr. Chairman, I did rather strongly urge in principle that the authority over census operations be left at the Census Bureau. And just to continue with that, you talk about what level this decision should be made. The Census Bureau constantly releases data. We're going to release the apportionment numbers without outside review. There's no, we have to self-audit the numbers. There's no other place in the country where we can sort of say, are these the apportionment numbers the right numbers? It's our job. We do the best we can. So I don't quite understand your point about self-audit. What else could an agency do except do its work, report it the best it can in an open, transparent fashion?
Well, when you have a new approach to try to use adjusted sets of numbers, you seek outside advice. For example, you sought the National Academy of Sciences advice and other panels, and I know you had a hearing or a two-day meeting back, say, in February, where you bring in people. There are distinguished statisticians, as you well know, that are highly respected people that don't agree with this method of adjustment. But there is no outside group looking at this. After the fact, there will be. But, I mean, it's all strictly internal at this stage, and in my opinion, it's a biased decision has already been made. That hasn't been allowed for that, public scrutiny. The transparency that we talk about does not exist because no outside group will have the data to evaluate it until after the fact, right?
Yes, sir. Is it your recommendation then that we don't release the apportionment counts until some outside agency reviews them?
No, the apportionment counts, I mean, ultimately the Secretary of Commerce has to release that data. The question is, do you go to an adjusted set of data, which the courts have ruled are illegal for apportionment purposes, and it's never been tried. When they tried it in 1990, it was a failure. If Barbara Bryant had released them back in February, March of 1991, it would have been an embarrassment to this country because we would have automatically taken a congressional seat, for example, away from Pennsylvania and given it another state. And so it took them 2 years to figure out the problems in the 1990s. Let me proceed. It seems that any non-lawyer could read this proposal, and we'll give you a copy of the CRS document, which is CRS is the Congressional Research Service, which is a division of the Library of Congress. It's certainly not anybody can charge as a biased agency or a partisan organization. It is one that members of Congress can ask for a unbiased opinion. But any non-lawyer could read this proposal and realize that the idea of a cabinet member giving away his authority that was vested in him by federal law is illegal. I'm curious as who is the lawyer that drafted this, and if you don't know, perhaps John Thompson could let me know exactly who made this legal decision, because I feel very confident it's illegal.
Well, you're addressing questions to me which properly ought to be addressed to the Department of Commerce.
I'm just interested who the lawyer is, or can you get me the names of the lawyer that takes responsibility for this?
I would presume it's the Department of Commerce lawyer. This is not a document that we produced.
Right, okay.
This is a Department of Commerce
Well, if you would just, seek, if you or Mr. Thompson.
I would urge you to talk to Andy Pincus, would be the person who could probably give you that information.
Okay.
He is the counsel to the Department of Commerce.
The clearest example of how ridiculous this proposal is that the legal authority cited as the basis for this proposal refers to the Secretary's ability to delegate certain activities or decisions. Well, I'm sure the Secretary delegates decisions all the time, as all managers do, as you do all the time. But he is ultimately responsible for the decisions of all those under him. Delegating authority is one thing. Divesting authority is another. It's difficult to believe a serious lawyer came up with this. This proposal is simply illegal on its face. Also, this move is blatantly political. Secretary Daley announced this proposal, and then 24 hours later, he goes on to run the Gore campaign. It's clearly an attempt to try and subvert the will of the majority of Congress and put presumptive President Bush in a box. I hope the Bureau and the Commerce Department will overcome their senses and withdraw this ridiculous proposal. Otherwise, it's sure to face defeat in the courts. Let me switch to an issue of openness, transparency, and public scrutiny. In your written testimony, you state that, quote, the third element of a good census involves openness, transparency, and public scrutiny, which in turn can lead to public trust in the process. You talk about the importance of public scrutiny, but everything about this proposed regulation, particularly the notion of an internal review panel, goes against the notion of public scrutiny. If you're really serious about the importance of public scrutiny, why won't you allow for an independent, scientific analysis of the ACE process before your decision to release adjusted numbers to the states for redistricting?
Mr. Chairman, we have statutory deadlines to meet, and we will meet those with respect to the redistricting data tape. We have statutory deadlines to meet with respect to the apportionment number, and we'll meet that deadline. I might say the apportionment number, of course, is quote-unquote an adjusted number. That is, there is a current apportionment number based upon non-response follow-up. We're now going to do a new operation called SIFU. That will adjust that number. We will keep adjusting that number until we get to the day we have to release it.
Counting real people, not virtual people.
No, we don't ever count virtual people. We've had this conversation
Well,
before.
virtual people is what you do when you adjust.
That's your language, not our language, sir. There are no virtual people.
That's what adjustment, when you use statistical sampling, you're creating virtual people.
As you know, Mr. Chairman, the apportionment number includes imputed census records, right? Imputed census records. The apportionment number includes imputed census records. That is, people we have not talked to, but we impute into the census file.
But they're real people based on
imputed.
neighbors.
They're imputed census records.
Huh?
They are imputed census records.
Well, but they're identifying an individual, a specific individual. When you do statistical adjustment, you're talking about a virtual person. There is, to me, a significant difference. Now, maybe you say, when you go get a form in the mail and you fill out that form, you've got the forms on your desk. Those are real people. And if you have to go knock on the door, you talk to that person, or you, ultimately using proxy data, you talk to a neighbor, they say, yes, John Jones lived there on April 1. I mean, that's a real person. Now, you're going to create a virtual person in sampling adjustment. You don't have a name to that person. You have no identification of that person. You're statistically going to create a person, or statistically eliminate a person. You're going to do both. That's the way the statistical adjustment works.
Right, and just to make certain we have the record correct, in the apportionment number, there will be a certain number of census records which are put there through an imputation process. Those are not people with names. They are not people who filled out a form. They are people who our statistical processes lead us to believe by putting that census record in there, we have given the country a more accurate number. That's an adjusted number. It's not the kind of the basic count we had after non-response follow-up, because we do lots of work between now and then, and that, we believe, gets that estimate of the count closer to the truth.
So a homeless person that you don't have a name to a homeless person, but we see a physical body.
No, I'm talking about an imputed census file, not a homeless person without a name. And I can explain in detail how we do that. But it's certainly a process of trying to get the estimate of the count closer to the truth. We will do that. That is not done with any external scientific agency. That's done by the Census Bureau, because that's our job. And we will do it
Strong
on
foundation
schedule.
for doing that. It's different from statistical adjustment where you use the virtual people. Ms. Maloney.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have only just seen the legal memo that you received from CRS, but even from a very brief reading, the CRS report that I read supports the proposed rule. And I'd like to quote on page 2, it says, Congress explicitly delegated To the Secretary of Commerce, the authority and responsibility for a decision concerning the use of sampling and the reporting of tabulations for redistricting to the states. The Secretary may delegate such authority to the Director of the Census Bureau. So the memo goes on to suggest some changes to the language of the proposed rule, and that, of course, is why we have a comment period, and I am sure that the Secretary of Commerce would welcome any of your comments and consider your opinions. So I just would like to put that on the record. Director Pruitt, only because the chairman raised the issue, I would just like to ask you, what would happen if, say, which I don't believe is going to happen, G.W. Bush is elected president, and he then overturns the rule, since he has not come out in support of correcting for the undercount. What would the Census Bureau do if that scenario happened?
Oh, I believe the Census Bureau would release the numbers that we were instructed to release, if we were so instructed. It would not, obviously, my guess is, that's why this conversation about whether it's political or not political is hard to follow, because we presume that this decision, that is, the chairman presumes this decision is going to be made by a Republican-appointed Secretary of Commerce and a Republican-appointed Census Bureau Director. So I can't quite follow the logic of what makes it political, the fact that it's been announced now, even though it's going to take effect for post change in administration. All the Census Bureau will do in February and March, as it pours through its data based upon everything that is accumulated about the census, is say, what are the best set of numbers that we can give to the American people for the purpose of redistricting and federal funding and other statistical purposes. And they will then say to the Census Bureau Director, as I understand this delegation, Mr. Director, Mrs. Director, we believe these are the very best set of numbers that we can produce from this decennial census process. And if the director then says, fine, I take your advice, that's what I'm going to do, he or she can say, no, I don't take your advice, make a different decision. If he or she is then overruled by his or her boss, I simply don't know what the status of that will be. But the Census Bureau itself simply does what it can do to produce the best set of numbers it knows how to produce in the time frame available to it, to meet its statutory deadlines, and will therefore say, these are the numbers.
Only because the chairman has raised it, I'd like to go into what is a political appointee. A political appointee is a presidential appointee. How many people work at the Census Bureau?
Well, as I say, right now it goes to 500,000, but in the kind of the permanent staff is more like 6,000 or 7,000.
And how many people out of those thousands are presidential appointees?
There's one presidential appointee. There are three other, I think called Schedule C appointees, which are, you could describe them as political appointees. I might say of those three, one does intergovernmental relations, one does public information, and one does legislative relationships. None of them have anything what to do with any technical decisions made at the Census Bureau.
So
I'm the only person that connects to the technical end of the Census Bureau who is a presidential appointee.
So you are the only presidential appointee, and everyone else is a career civil servant?
Yes, as a matter of fact.
So it doesn't matter who's president, they will be working there because they're career professionals.
Well, for example, the 6 people who are the senior people right behind me, for the most part, over the decennial, have collectively been associated with the Census Bureau. That is, their accumulated years of service to the Census Bureau total about 150 years. And if you add that to the 12 regional directors, the 12 regional directors, among them, have about 340 years of experience. So the people actually managing the decennial census collectively have nearly 500 years of census experience.
And they're professionals, and they've been
all,
there.
yeah. I mean, Mr. Thompson, who has had major authority, has been here for 25 years. He reports to someone else who's been here 32 years, who reports to somebody else who has been in the National Statistical System, not the Census Bureau, for nearly 30 years.
And how were you appointed? Are you a friend of President Clinton's?
No, I did not.
Did you work in his campaign?
No, I had nothing to do with his campaign.
Did you know him before you were appointed?
Not at all.
Had you ever met him before you were appointed?
No, sir. No, ma'am.
Are you even a member of a political club?
No, I've never been a member of a political club. I'm embarrassed to say these things, but I've not been very active in political. I've been an academic, and that's where I've spent my time.
Well, I consider politics and public service a very honorable career, especially when it's done wisely, honestly, and to help people. But your description doesn't sound like a politician, not even being a member of... Do you vote?
I try to vote. I'm a good citizen, I'll put it that way.
Well, then how were you appointed if you don't know the president? I mean, how did you get your job, this, quote, political job? How did you get it?
I was called by someone in the Department of Commerce and asked if I could recommend any names, and these were the criteria they gave to me. They said, we want a list of names, short list of names for the directorship who are reputable academics, scientists, who are not political. That actually was the criteria they gave me.
So they were looking for scientists and academics.
Right. And I gave them 5 names that I knew in the scientific community that I thought would be a first-rate director. They then said at the end of that conversation, can we put your name on this list? And I said, no, I've never worked for the government, don't intend to work for the government. And they said, would you think about it and call us back? And I mentioned to my wife, and she thought I should do it. She said, it will keep you younger.
I think it's giving you more gray hair.
Yeah,
But who called you from the Census Department? And then secondly, what was your job when they called you? What were you doing?
Robert Shapiro made that call. He was and is undersecretary. I was president of the Social Science Research Council based in New York City.
So you were heading a scientific organization. Well, had you ever met Secretary Daley?
No, I'd never met Secretary Daley.
Were you even interviewed by Secretary Daley?
At one point in the process, after I think I met Mr. Shapiro and then Mr. Mallett, I spent about, maybe 20 minutes with Secretary Daley.
Well, have you ever met with the president since you've been appointed?
I wouldn't call it a meeting, Congresswoman. Someone at the White House thought I should have a photo op, and we met in the hall for what I would say was about 10 seconds. I don't mean to, the president's he's a busy man. I do not know for certain if he knew he was talking to the director of the Census Bureau.
So you had, what, a 10-second photo op or a 10-minute photo op?
I think it was 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Right.
So you've been with the president 10 seconds. So it's hard, he's not visiting the Census Bureau or interacting in any way or whatever. No. So it sounds to me that you are a professional academic scientist who has been appointed to a position of tremendous importance in our government. My time has expired, and I thank the chairman.
Mr. Davis?
Thank you very much. And Dr. Pruitt, I do believe that academicians can join political clubs. I think it's quite appropriate. Absolutely. Well, in Chicago, everybody's political, so you can't live in Chicago and not be political. Let me ask you, Dr. Pruitt, since much has been made about the whole business of the delegation of authority, and this question is probably outside your realm, but if there was no Secretary of Commerce, who would then make the decisions about the operation of the department?
Well, I think it would only be the Census Bureau director.
Yeah. And I guess my point is the secretary really didn't have to make his determination before leaving, and yet a decision would have gotten made at some point anyway. I mean, that's kind of the way I see that. And so it's difficult for me to suggest that would have just simply been a political decision being made by the Secretary, other than to provide as much assurance as one could provide that the technical decisions are in fact going to be made by technicians rather than politicians. I mean, but at any rate, you made a statement at one point relative to statistical corrected data and suggested that that would be more accurate. What is statistical corrected data?
In a census, Mr. Davis, what we actually believe is that you can't know the truth. You can only get an estimate of the truth. So what a census is, nothing more complicated than a series of operations that constantly try to get that estimate closer to what the truth is. And that's why I say, we currently have an estimate. We've now, look, we have 33,000 more households to reach in non-response follow-up, 319 in Memphis, by the way. But we're basically finished. We could produce a number now. We think we can improve that number by doing these next big operations. As I say, we're going back out in the field to some 8 or 10 million households. We think that will improve that number. We will keep improving this number to try to get this estimate closer and closer and closer to what we think the truth is. One of those operations, one of those, not only one out of a dozen, or well, counting all the small ones, but 3 other big ones, is the accuracy and coverage evaluation. In that operation, we simply do something which has been described as capture-recapture in wildlife studies. You take the census record, you go out and re-examine that household, and then you match the records together. And what that is in those households which have a set of demographic characteristics, inner city African Americans who rent their homes and who are come from low response rate areas. We now have a sample of those kinds of people in the country. And we find out how many of them we missed. And if our calculation is we miss 4% of them, then where they live across the country, we will add 4% census records, not virtual people, census records. This is a statistical operation. It's not a kind of identification of people operation. That's all the correction is. It also turns out that we overcount. Some people send in more than one form, and we have a process of identifying that. And we think it's extremely important that we take those census, that when we do the corrected file, that those counts are appropriately reduced, because we shouldn't double count certain social groups in this country.
Do you believe, as I do, that if we were to take our best numerators, the best people that we've got, and have them count until the end of the year, that there still would be some people that we would have missed?
Regrettably, I do have to agree to that. We have had enumerators met with guns. We have had enumerators physically abused. We have had respondents who send us in $100 saying, we understand that's the fine. I'd rather pay the fine than ever answer this question. We certainly have people who are here illegally and they do not want to be counted. You know, if you read this marvelous series now in the New York Times on race relations in the United States, you get some idea of the complexity of this population out there. And there are population groups who will not cooperate with this census or who we can't find. So there is no process that can reach all 275 million, give or take, whatever the quality of our numerators are.
Even though those individuals will not cooperate, do you feel that it would be unfair to them to not have them included in the ultimate count?
Yes, sir, and wrong for the country. If we know that we are undercounting and overcounting, and we know that because we've been working on this for 50 years, then to produce a census that doesn't recognize that strikes us as failing our responsibilities to the country.
Again, let me just commend you and the Bureau for, I think, the outstanding work that you've done and even the corrected action that has been taken in some instances that may have started rather sluggish, but it's not always a matter of how you start. It's far more important how you finish. And I think we're going to finish well. Thank you very much.
Ford, left. Oh. Okay. Let me initially make a comment in response to Ms. Maloney that you know what the statement in that Secretary Daley released says the determination of the director of the census shall not be subject to review, reconsideration, or reversal by the Secretary of Commerce. The law doesn't give them permission to do that. I mean, that's not what the law says. Now, I know we're not lawyers here. I don't know if Ms. Maloney is, but that's what the real question is. And you know, the ultimate responsibility has to be there, whether it's a secretary or every cabinet secretary. That's where the decision is. I said, you know, this two-number census is going to become a mess, and we need to put the responsibility right at the level that it belongs. And since Ms. Maloney continued the question of a political appointee, there's nothing wrong with being a political appointee. That's where our system works. And you have a distinguished record, just as Dr. Varmus, who headed NIH for so many years and such did. And so it's never a question of whether you're political, but as political, I mean, you end up in, basically the president or whoever he has that power, the Secretary of Commerce or his assistant or whoever, is going to select people for the job that's going to be along with their beliefs and positions. And so the concern is that, it's not a concern, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way the system works. And I don't think you were contacted because you're a loyal Republican. I mean, I don't think you give financial contributions to the Republican Party. Do you give political contributions, or have you? Or?
Yes, I have.
To the Republicans?
To the best candidate that I can find.
Any Republicans? Well, just to make sure the record's correct, I have certainly not given any political contribution since I've had this job. That's right. But previously, I think you probably have made contributions to the Democratic Party and such, and that's nothing wrong with that. Hey,
correct.
We both need political contributions to keep our jobs, so I have no problems with that. You stated last week at your press conference that there was no bonus system for census employees, and you wanted to dispel the rumor that there was one. So is there no bonus system for census employees? Would you comment on that?
There is no bonus system connected to that is the reference that I was making there had to do with a bonus system for enumerators or crew leaders or other workers who completed their decennial work on time. The Census Bureau has incentive programs and award programs across its system and has had that for years and years and years. But the particular reference in the press that I saw had to do with a bonus system for completing work in, I think, the Los Angeles region. There is no bonus system connected to the decennial. We are not allowed by law, for example, to give any kind of program or payment to any temporary employees, and of course...
Let me ask a question. I mean, I'll clarify this. I mean, you've seen this. We'll get you a copy of it. It's recommendation for recognition, and you got Special Achievement Award, Special Act of Service Award, Special Operating Unit, Cash in a Flash Award, On the Spot Award, Time Off Award. I don't have nothing wrong with it. I think bonuses, is what makes the system. We need to have incentives in our system, and so I mean, I'm not opposed to them, but bottom line is there are bonuses. I mean, you may want to call it another name, but they are, bonuses for getting the job done right. Isn't that right? I mean, that's part of. I mean, other parts.
Oh yes. Oh no. I say we call them incentive programs across
the Census Bureau. Right? That's a bonus incentive.
No, we can, if you want to. Surely, I have no trouble with that word.
We're getting into this. Bill Clinton, what's the definition of the word is?
No, we can call them bonuses if you're more comfortable.
Well, I mean, the concern you have is that we're rewarding people for.
Sir, could you turn the thing around so we can see what you put up here?
Okay. Yeah. And again, there's nothing wrong with this. It's just that the concern you have is that make sure that we're making the proper balance between timeliness and quality. We don't want to make sure we lose any quality. Let me switch. I got time to go to the question of proxy data. During the last hearing, we discussed proxy data. Enumerators attempt 6 contacts, and if they can't speak to someone in the household, They go to a third-party source, such as a neighbor or a postal carrier. This is proxy. During the 1998 dress rehearsals, the Census Bureau found very high amounts of proxy in the non-response universe, 20% in Sacramento, 16.4% in South Carolina, 16.5% in Menominee. The Census Bureau concluded that the high amount of proxy was a result of census workers not following procedures in the field. This directly affects the quality of the data. How can you or I be confident that the Census Bureau remedied the problem when you are not measuring proxy data at the local census office level?
Oh, we certainly will use proxy data in the decennial census. We're using it now. We think that proxy data are...
The question is the level of it. Are we overusing it? And I think in the dress rehearsals, it was overused in some areas.
Well, I'm not sure
quickly.
what the definition of overused and underused is. Proxy data are better than no data. They simply are. We do everything we can to get a population count for every housing unit in the country. If we get that from a knowledgeable neighbor or from a building manager, we believe that is far superior to leaving that census file out of the census record. So we're not defensive about proxy data at all. We would prefer to get the response from the respondent. We would prefer that everyone mailed their form back in. They didn't. We would prefer that when we knocked on the door, they answered the door and said, certainly, here's the information.
The question is, I mean, proxy data is necessary. I mean, we all understand it, and it's certainly better than no data. The question is, when you get to, in Sacramento, it was 20% was proxy data. I mean, I think that's on the high side. It was 16.4% in South Carolina, 16.5% in Menominee. And there was concern that was overused or jumped into it too quickly. Now that we have the time, that we're ahead of schedule, we should be able to, keep going back to count the people that Mr. Davis and all say we want to get counted. And I'm saying do everything we can to get them counted because they're real people, because the idea of adjustment, as I say, is going to probably be thrown out. So let's just get the best job we can and not cut corners now.
Yes, sir. No, we have no trouble with that recommendation, and we are not cutting corners, of course, and won't cut corners.
But you're not measuring proxy data at the local census office, or what level are you measuring proxy data? I mean, what percentage? I mean, is it?
Well, every questionnaire that we produce has a set of tags on it, one of which is whether it is a proxy questionnaire or not. We're not measuring that now. We'll measure that and report that to the country when we've got all the data.
Wouldn't that be important to measure the success of a local census office to know?
Well, we measure the success of the local census office.
Whether they use proxy data, isn't that?
We use a number of other indicators we think are better.
If you don't mind, since I already started the second round, if Mr. Ford's back, if you don't mind, we'll go to Mr. Ford. Is that all right, Ms. Maloney? Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just trying to figure out where you were going with the line of questioning. Perhaps I can have the bonus piece. What point were you trying to make with that? Just again, maybe I'm not.
My concern is that we're rushing out of the field too quickly and not getting the best quality data. And I mean, I think bonuses are fine. The question is quality. And since we're ahead of schedule, I'm saying stay in the field and make sure we get everybody counted in your district and Mr. Davis's district, the hardest to count districts, rather than jumping to proxy data, which I think everybody agrees is not good as good a quality as if an enumerator can knock on the door and see a real person. And that's all I'm saying. We got to make sure that we're not overusing proxy data.
My second question would be with regard to the politics of all of this. The concern with this authority being vested with the Director Pruitt, what is the concern? Is it a concern, say for instance, hypothetically, Mr. Bush is the next president and come April of next year, is there some concern that his Commerce Secretary won't have the authority to make this decision versus, that's what I'm a little confused with, and I don't know. I mean, we've reached a very, very low point here if we can't take people at their word. I mean, the fellow here has made very clear that, the director here has made very clear that his purpose as director is not to advance some Democratic agenda, but to try to get an accurate count. So I'm just curious as to what it is we're concerned of. Maybe I'm missing it, and admittedly, I'm not the quickest guy here, but maybe I'm missing something here.
Two comments I have. First of all, you can delegate authority, but to divest authority is illegal. So I think let's get beyond that. The question is not using independent outside advice. That's my concern, to just have in-house. If we went to Los Alamos and we did it all internally,
this isn't Los Alamos, though. I understand it. It's an explosive term right now, Mr. And I agree with Senator Byrd and others who have criticized my friend Bill Richardson, but this is not Los Alamos.
Outside, but it's saying, the next is George W. Bush, and I don't know, I've never discussed this with him, certainly, or even anybody in his staff. If they want to bring in outside experts, the National Academy of Sciences, which is respected, to look at the data to give advice, that's not allowed under this regulation. This regulation says only the people within the Bureau inside can make the decision. And I think you should have outside experts give some advice. That's not provided. After the fact it is. And that's my concern, is that the decision process is trying to be, set into concrete now where, I'm not sure this is the right decision process.
So the concern is not a political, it's more you want to ensure that we get as many voices and as many...
Right, but they're setting a rule that only the people that design the plan will ultimately decide the answer. That's, when you have any corporation, you use an outside auditor, you bring in consultants to help make a decision. When National Academy of Sciences or National Institute of Health, they use peer review. They get outside advice. They don't just have inside people making the decision. And what the proposed regulation is, all inside people only, and nobody outside.
Is it a regulation that we can address, Mr. Chairman? Is there something we can perhaps amend?
Well, it's a regulation that they're going to impose at the Commerce Department, unilaterally. Now, we're going to have a chance for comment, and certainly we'll put some comments in there, but it's not something, they're going over Congress's head.
Mr. Director, I mean, I think they're legitimate. I'd just rather get to the issue here as opposed to talking about definitions of is. I mean, this is not Los Alamos, and this is not an impeachment inquiry here. I'm curious as to what can we do. What is your attitude towards the thoughts and the concerns that the chairman has expressed? I do know the National Academy of Sciences, if I'm not mistaken, also suggested that perhaps sampling wouldn't be a bad idea. And there were, they said actually, I think unequivocally
supports the concept. They have not approved this plan because they haven't had a chance to review the plan. They will review it after the fact.
Right. So I only raise that point to say that there's obviously, I understand it may be convenient at times to support organizations that support your point at one time, and I'd wonder if they'd come back and supported something that the administration, since we all believe that politics plays such a excessive role in all of this. But notwithstanding that, how do you feel about some of these recommendations or thoughts? I wouldn't characterize them as recommendations yet, Mr. Chairman, because I don't think they're not fully thought out yet, but the thoughts that the chairman has expressed, Director Pruitt.
Surely, Congressman Ford, two things, if I could say it. First, as we all know, the census design has been subjected to a great deal of outside advice, scrutiny, consultation with statistical community for about 8 years.
8 years?
Yes, 8 years. Four different committees of the National Academy of Science have been connected to us, reviewing our work and so forth. This is not something that's being done by some little group of insiders. It's being done with enormous consultation across this country. There are some very good statisticians, largely at the University of California, Berkeley, who have different views. They, incidentally, Mr. Miller, do believe in adjusting, but they would use a raking method, which is a different method from dual system estimation. We actually believe that a raking method is less powerful and statistically robust than dual system estimation. But they also understand that there's an undercount, and the way to fix this undercount is to use a different adjustment method. So we're really arguing about two different kinds of adjustment methods. But specifically, Mr. Ford, to your comment, in 1980, the director of the census was Vince Baraba. He had been appointed, served already under President Nixon, had then left when President Carter came in. The decennial census was not in good shape in 1980, and he was brought back. That is, he was appointed by a Republican, was a Republican, brought back by a Democratic administration to run the decennial census. He made the decision with internal advice about whether to release the numbers or not. He decided against it because they weren't robust enough. When I was considering taking this job, I talked to Vince Baraba, and I said, what advice do you give me? He said, the most important advice I can give you is get every possible decision you can out of the Commerce Department and back to the Department of the Census Bureau where it belongs. And that is a Republican Census Director giving me advice. I then talked to Barbara Bryant, who is also a Republican Census Director. And I said, what advice do you have for me? She said, every decision that you can bring back to the Department, to the Census Bureau is better than any decisions that are left the Commerce Department. The statistical community will very, very substantially support this decision because they believe the kind of people who ought to be making this decision are statisticians and technicians and so forth. That's what they believe. And so if you want to take if you want to draw a sample of the statistical community and ask their judgment about this, they will all agree that this is the right thing to do. If it turns out to be illegal, then it won't happen. This was not a Census Bureau decision, but it's certainly one that I strongly support. And it's apolitical. I don't know who's going to be the Census Director when this decision is made. I leave with this administration. It's not about me. It's about the proper way to organize what is a scientific effort. And that's what this is. It's not a political effort, it's a scientific effort.
And I guess my concern, Mr. Chairman, I understand that the need that have, I guess, liberally use the term competition in terms of ideas to create more, to generate more ideas and more thoughts and more voices on this and more opinions. But what's to stop them from being influenced by politics? I mean, we treat it as if it's a dirty word in some ways, and then we suggest we don't, even outside that, we suggest we don't want any of it, but we assume the worst all the time in people. Whether it's the National Academy of Sciences, or we're going to check to see if the director or chairman or president of that organization, his or hers, history of political contributions, and his deputy or her deputy, then his or her deputy, then look at all. I mean, at some point, when does it stop, and when do we just take people at their word that in Director Pruitt, and I would imagine all of us, as much as we may differ on some issues, we all are interested in a accurate count. Now, there's no doubt there are implications to an accurate count. I mean, we all know that in some areas where it's suggested that when you're able to count more minorities, and as an African-American member of Congress, you know, there's a belief that African-Americans vote Democratic more than they vote Republican, and I guess numbers will probably bear that out. But I don't know why that would stop us from winning an accurate count, just as if you suggest that perhaps white men vote more Republican than they vote Democrat. I'm not urging white men in my state not to be counted so I can have more African-Americans and more women to be counted. I want all folks to be counted, as you do too, Mr. Chairman. So I guess my question is, when does it stop? I mean, I can appreciate the recommendations we're going to make, and I would recommend at this point that we perhaps invite Mr. Pruitt's two predecessors to perhaps get their thoughts on this as well. I believe you, Mr. Pruitt, that they told you that, but I think for the sake of the committee and the record, that perhaps we ought to provide your predecessors and those with experience in this area an opportunity to make those statements public. I know my time has run out, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Souter? Souter, before you start, could I just have 30 seconds of your time?
Be happy to yield.
I just want to make sure that we know that this Congress and the previous Congresses have given all the financial resources needed to do the census. I don't think anyone disputes that. I mean, $6 billion is going to be involved here, because our belief is we need to do everything we can with all the resources we can to get the very, very best count. And so I'm proud that I have worked hard, through my position on the census, on the appropriations subcommittee, to make sure that money was there. And this goes back to Speaker Gingrich and Speaker Hastert have both provided the financial resources. And so we just need to all work together on that common goal. You back.
I thank the chairman. I apologize for missing your statement. I'll make sure I read it, and I'm trying to read it in between here, and been kind of a erratic attendance member of the subcommittee through this part, but was very involved in this earlier when Speaker Hastert then was in his subcommittee and was involved in the early stages, and we've been through a lot of this. But I share the concern, both a legal technical concern about the transfer of authority, and I don't mean to imply direct questions about the integrity of you as director or whoever the new director is. But I think, and the reason I moved over this side, usually the Republicans are on that side, and it was making Mr. Ford very uncomfortable. He not used to turning to his left to find me, and he couldn't sort me out when I was...
He wasn't used to being to my left either, Mr. Chairman.
Because I think that everybody, regardless of their political background, tries to do the best they can once they're given the responsibility in government. But you still come in with biases. No matter who you are, whether it was me or you in a given position. And part of my immediate reaction to a decision like this, and having been on this oversight committee since I came to Congress, and have dealt with this in agency after agency, and want to assume the best about every individual and every decision. But it's no accident that when you, in the language, move it to the department and say, this is a professional decision, that this department position is still a Schedule C. It's a political position. And it shouldn't be while you're more knowledgeable about the substance of the issue than the Secretary of Commerce, you're still a political appointee. And one concern here beyond the legal concern is an impression that's given to the general public that somehow if the director of the census makes a statement as opposed to the Congress, that it's not that one's professional and one's political, when in fact we're all politicians here. You're representative of a political appointee of a politically elected official, and we're directly politically elected, but you are in the political arm with a staff underneath you that is a mix of, but predominantly not politically appointed. At the same time, we all know, particularly those of us who have been involved in politics a long time, how we get layers of bureaucracy and staffing and how you get promoted and good assignments internally, that you try to, even in the day and age of non-patronage employment, people who share ideas are going to have their most trusted advisors come with shared ideas. And we have a major philosophical divide as to the ultimate value and how much we can trust estimating. I'm sitting in a situation, and I've just been appalled at the unwillingness of people to confront directly the difficulty of what we're facing here, and that we all know it, and we ought to acknowledge it, and then try to address this gap. And it's a range of things, but hey, it's not easy to count illegal immigrants. They don't want to be counted. And it's not easy to count people who are homeless because they move around and they don't want to be counted. They wouldn't be homeless if they were organized and willing to be counted. You know, drug dealers don't want to be counted. People who are on the lam or worried somebody's going to pick them up for being arrested don't want to be counted. Some of my more paranoid right-wing friends don't want to be counted. My guess is there are parts of Montana that Census Bureau people are not necessarily, and I don't mean to isolate Montana, but that's kind of the news media emphasis. We have certainly parts in my district. I mean, I had somebody come up to me at a parade who was worried that the ATF was going to come after him, and he's got two guns kind of pointed, and he's in a trailer, and I'm thinking, boy, I hope some census worker doesn't knock on his door. I mean, we have all kinds of people who don't want to be counted, and yet at the same time, to be fair to everybody, we've got to figure out how to count them. But when you have variations in some cities of the homeless population between 25,000 and 125,000, that differential in Los Angeles alone wipes out 4 of my counties if we estimate at the high as opposed to the low. And that it's not a racial argument. It's, are my people going to be cheated if somebody errs on the side of estimating high as opposed to estimating low? I know we have supposedly 125 crack houses in Fort Wayne that a lot of those have been torn down. It doesn't mean somebody's in them at any time, but what it means is they move from night to night. That becomes very difficult to estimate. And many of us want to say that, and what we're pushing is, every exhaustive possibility ought to be done before any estimating is done. And that even in the bonus system, in a bonus system, the encouragement should be for exhaustive approaches, not for speed. An assembly line, by stressing speed, cannot get as much qualitative level, and then we could jump to the estimating faster than possible. A possible check in a system like that is a penalty. If the estimating in your area shows a bigger gap than somebody of a similar neighborhood, then maybe you should lose your bonuses that you got earlier by going too fast. Because private business may give commissions and bonuses, but there are also things that would suggest the inefficiency of certain census workers than others. But that might discourage different activities too. I'm just suggesting that ultimately we all know there's going to have to be some supplement. And it's a question of how aggressive it's going to be and whether or not the tilt here is, and what our concern is, that by transferring this to your authority, it looks like an attempt of the administration to almost wash their hands and say, oh, we're going to not be political, and because we're a little bit ahead, we're going to kick this to statistics, a form of sophisticated guessing. So, but it's still guessing, but it is a lot more sophisticated. And so it's going to be, assuming you have dual tracking and different things, fairly accurate, not necessarily to the sub-track level, which is important for local things. And maybe we have ways we can make sure everybody understands that. But there's another thing. It's kind of ironic. At this particular point in time, the Secretary of Commerce just went over to be the manager of the presidential candidate. Well, isn't that convenient? Because it makes it look like he removed it. I mean, the timing here was not opportune. If you're on the other side of the spectrum, you look at this and say, hey, this looks a little suspicious. It looks like the presidential candidate doesn't want to be associated in controversial areas and in swing areas with the decision, and he tried to make it look like he was taking it out in a way so it didn't matter that Mr. Daley was leaving and was kicking it down. And yes, sometimes we are a little paranoid on our side, but quite frankly, some of that paranoia has been fairly justified. Not always, but sometimes, and that's why many of us are upset with this, not necessarily that we aren't going to go to statistic sampling, not believing that you aren't going to try to do the best you can, but you're going to bring a little more trust to the statistics than some of us would necessarily have, and we want to make sure everything else has been exhausted first, because possibly political control of Congress is going to be dependent on this. Variations of whether my district gets grants may depend on this. Controls of city councils may depend on this. This is a weighty political decision of we need to make sure both sides are represented very fairly and accurately in this debate. And I know I gave a long statement. I'd appreciate any comments you might have with that.
And your time's about up.
Yeah. I think that's pink, though, rather than red. That was my first and second round.
Well, it seems to me Mr. Souder's not being able to join us very often. He should get some benefit of the doubt, right? And if I could, I won't address all of your issues. I would like to address them at sort of the generic level, general level that you basically met them as, I think. Mr. Souder, I must say I would be very, very saddened if this delegation of authority issue became yet a part of, deepened the sort of the concern among members of Congress that this is a politically charged census. I would much rather not have the delegation than have that. I have spent a lot of time, I came to Washington, quite honestly, not because I was politically active and so forth. I came to Washington because I had observed the fact that the Census Bureau had been characterized as perhaps being able to pre-design a census with a known partisan outcome. Actually, that is a false charge. We would not know how to do that. If you think about it for a moment, it means 3 years ago we were making design decisions that would affect redistricting 5 years later, and redistricting where, in which state, for what purpose. I mean, the intelligence that one would need to bring to bear on those technical decisions you were making 3 years ago for an impact, a partisan impact 5 years later, we don't have it. We don't know anything about voting trends. We're not experts in redistricting. We don't pay any attention to which governor, which state has Republican or Democratic majorities. We simply don't. We wouldn't know how to go about doing that. I don't think anyone in this country is smart enough to actually anticipate the partisan impact of a design decision in the census back when those design decisions are made. And so I felt very strongly that, and let me, just a word or two why I feel so strongly. I don't think you can have a healthy democracy without a healthy national number system. Not only can you not govern intelligently, the American people cannot hold political leaders to account without social indicators. When we debate in this country whether education is improving or not, when we debate whether the quality of health is improving or not, when we worry about whether inflation is being checked or not, we are using statistical indicators of those phenomena. And when political leaders are thrown out of office, they're often thrown out of office because the American voting public is saying, we don't like the way things are going. And when they say that, they're actually looking at statistical data. So I think democracy itself requires a very sound national number system. And I think if the word gets out and begins to be believed that the numbers can be politically tampered or changed or manipulated, you begin to erode confidence in those numbers, and that's a very dangerous place to be for society. I feel very strongly about that. So I have actually tried to comport myself with the Census Bureau staff in such a way that we could lessen that charge. And therefore, if this particular thing, this delegation, becomes evidence, if you would, on the part of some mindset, that somehow this is one more attempt to be political, I wish it would go away. I feel so strongly about trying to take this thing out of politics that I don't want to do anything that leaves that impression. This wasn't my decision. This was a Department of Commerce decision. and you would have to, you know, do it. But I just want you to believe that I think nothing is more dangerous than to believe that the national number system is subjected to political manipulation or uses.
Okay. Let's complete the first round, even though I started the second round, but we'll go to Mr. Davis, and then next Ms. Maloney will continue the second round. So we're glad to have Mr. Davis with us, too, today.
Well, thank you very much. I apologize for being late. I had a bill and another committee being marked up. My recollection is that had we used adjusted numbers after the 1990 census, we would have been working on a nation on a foundation of numbers that contained huge errors, 45% errors, and that's huge errors.
No, that's incorrect, sir.
What would the error have been?
The magnitude of the adjustment, I don't know quite sure where you got that 45%. Just, Mr. Davis, we haven't had a chance to talk about this before. This country for the last 7 years has been making all of its major economic decisions. Its inflation rate, its unemployment rate,
what error
on those numbers, on the corrected numbers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics believes that if it had not been using these corrected numbers, it would have misestimated employment rates in this country by more than 1 million people.
So you stand behind the corrected numbers?
Yes, sir. They are better than the uncorrected numbers.
Mr. Davis, you yield for a
I'd be
second.
happy to.
The Census Bureau does not use it for any intercensal estimates. I mean, the Census Bureau does not use the adjusted numbers. My understanding is for the BLS, they only use them for selected large states or large population areas and not for all states. But I yield back.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the clarification. It forgives our paranoia here when we see the head of the Commerce Department, which was overseeing the census and has now made this delegation right before his Mayor Daley's brother moves over to run a national campaign on the other side. You can understand why we're...
Yes, sir.
I don't think it's just paranoia.
1 second, if you wouldn't mind. I know you're the chairman of the National Republican Campaign Committee, so I wouldn't dare suggest that your questioning is motivated at all by the fact that you're looking to maintain a majority. I have great respect for you, Mr. Davis, so to suggest that Mr. Coelho's
I have
illness...
nothing to do with... reclaiming my time, I have nothing to do with the count. I have zero to do with the count over there. I represent a district out in Fairfax County last time. Under their adjusted figures, we would have lost our percent of the pie in Virginia under those figures. So I represent those districts, and I
know you
stand
do,
behind
but
that
Mr.
district.
Daly said nothing about going to
I
be
read
chairman
today
of
in
the
the
presidential
Congress
campaign,
Daily.
Mr.
Can I have an order, please, Mr. Chairman? I didn't think we were going to get personal up here, but I did want to note what we were doing. I read today in Congress Daily that on Monday, the Justice Department asked the federal court to postpone its consideration of Virginia law, a Virginia plan that was passed by our state Senate, passed by our state House, and in fact, it passed our state House with some bipartisan vote, to use an actual head count for redrawing legislative districts next year. Were you or were any employees of the Census Bureau consulted on the Justice Department's decision?
Absolutely not. We don't know about those things. We don't pay attention to those things, sir.
Okay. Well, can you think why anyone would want to postpone a decision like that would make it get
Mr.
this
Davis,
out?
There are legal decisions going on all over this country. I don't pay any attention to those. My job is to produce the numbers. And I can't begin to give you an explanation for those decisions.
Can you understand why anyone would want to postpone a decision like that?
I'm not even knowledgeable about the question you're asking me.
Well, let me explain it to you, and then maybe you can give me an answer. Virginia basically said that they were going to use the actual enumeration for purposes of drawing their legislative districts within the state. Virginia passed a law that said it was signed by the governor, duly elected officials sponsored this, taken to court to try to get an early clarification, because when it comes to drawing the lines, you'd like to know early on what is acceptable and what may not be acceptable, and I think it just sets up a playing field. It doesn't say something else isn't legal. And now the Justice Department has intervened and said they want to postpone this. Why would anyone want to postpone it? Can you think of any reason?
No, but I'm just not a lawyer. I don't follow these things at all. What my position has been, the Census Bureau's position has been, is that we're going to produce the best numbers we can, and their use is up to the states. We don't dictate what states use what numbers. That's not our job. We're simply producing them.
So if a state wants to get a clarification over what's legal, you don't have a problem with that, or see why it should be postponed?
I simply, as I say, you've told me more about this instance than I had any pre-knowledge of.
Go back and look at it.
It has nothing to do with the Census Bureau. It has to do with the Department of Justice.
Well, it all has to do with apportionment, which your numbers with two different numbers, obviously you get two different apportionment resolutions when it goes to the state. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
I mean, the redistricting, not apportionment.
Yes.
The apportionment.
Well, apportionment within the districts, because it's been used in the court cases. I think it's been used interchangeably, but there's an argument, if you read the previous decision, that seems to think there's a difference between apportionment and redistricting. You can understand why they want to get an early decision, why they would want to do that.
Certainly.
And rather than drag this out and forcing this into next year, the earlier a state could find out what would be acceptable, or at least one method that may be acceptable and maybe bulletproof from a legal attack, that would be logical, it seems to me.
Yes, sir. I mean, I'm not disputing that so much as I'm just uninformed about it.
Okay.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to.
What I don't understand, because you're in a politically sensitive position. I mean, we've had hearings here for years in advance about the split between whether we have an accurate a enumerated count versus an estimated count. And I assume that some idea of why there's such a big battle over these figures, because, for example, years ago, legislatures, even though it wasn't states don't do counts, so when the Supreme Court ruled that rural areas were overestimated versus urban areas, the only numbers they have to go to are your numbers. States don't do counts. The Constitution gives it to you. You have some concept of that history, and therefore, because you have some concept of that history, you would understand how that even though they're not required to use these numbers, there aren't other numbers, and that the courts, when they overrule them, would use your numbers. So when you say that you don't have an awareness of how that's, I understand you're not necessarily directly following it, but you would have a general idea.
Yes, sir.
And also, these are legal matters that are affected by the decisions you make. You put out two numbers. What do you expect legislators to do? I mean, so the decisions you make affects that. I just want to clarify my question again. So no one at the Census Bureau, to your knowledge, was consulted by the Justice Department?
No, sir.
On this?
Not to my knowledge, and I don't know who it would have been.
Mr. Davis? Yeah, as I said earlier, I mean, ultimately this is going to be decided by the Supreme Court. I mean, you would agree the Supreme Court is going to eventually rule on whether we use adjusted numbers for redistricting. You don't have an opinion? I mean,
on whether this will go to the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
I really don't know.
You don't think any courts will rule on this decision?
Oh, no, I think courts will rule, yes.
All right. And wouldn't it be to everybody's advantage to have the courts rule sooner than later? I mean, the sooner we know that, the better off everybody is, no?
As I've said in testimony, Mr. Chairman, I was very pleased at the timeliness of the previous Supreme Court decision. That enormously helped us in planning this census.
And actually, if you had that ruling a year early, it would have been even more helpful.
It would have been absolutely better. Absolutely. Yes,
and
sir.
so this question of using adjusted numbers for redistricting, the sooner the courts rule, the better off every state's going to be when they do redistricting, right?
The difference in the two decisions about the timeliness of them, this decision has nothing to do with our operations. The previous Supreme Court decision had enormous consequences for our operations. That's why its timeliness was better, and a year earlier would have been even better. But this one has no implications for what we're now doing.
It has huge implications to states making redistricting decisions, and the sooner the decision is made. So I'm just amazed that my knowledge is what I read in Congress Daily this morning. That's the first time I've seen something. Amazed that the Justice Department would not have put off that decision, and that's exactly what they're doing. So I'm glad you're not involved in it, Mr. Davis.
Yeah, I'm glad at least the Census Department is, and I, again, am appalled by the Justice Department decision. But I think, again, it's been very political in every other aspect of how it's conducted itself, and I think this case shows it once again. It's in an election year, it's not going to deviate from that position.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Ms. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that many of your colleagues raised some important points, and I believe that we should invite the Justice Department to come to our next hearing and explain their point of view. We should have the Voting Rights Division come in and tell us and explain why they feel the way they do. I think that that's a legitimate point that we raised, and I look forward to that hearing. Only because some of my dear friends and colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem so disturbed. They keep raising the point that Secretary Daley has or will be going over to join Vice President Gore's campaign. I really want to make a historical note in here that Mosbacher, the Secretary of Commerce under former President Bush, he overruled the Census Director, the professional, Dr. Barbara Bryant. Dr. Barbara Bryant ruled that adjusted numbers with modern scientific methods were far more accurate and that those should be the numbers used. Mosbacher overruled her professional scientific decision, then resigned and went over and ran the Bush campaign in 1992. But one point that was raised that, quite frankly, I didn't realize until you mentioned it, Dr. Pruitt, is that adjusted numbers are being used now by professional statistical organizations because they are more accurate. And I would like you to respond now and in greater detail in writing which ones are using adjusted numbers because they are more accurate. Before that, I want to make another point to one of my dear friends and colleagues who kept raising the point that many people don't want to be counted. The Constitution and all of our directions is that we're supposed to count everyone, whether they want to be counted or not. Quite frankly, in my district in New York, the local census office is having a very difficult time because they can't get past the doorman. And my office is calling up all the managers of all these buildings and helping the Census Department get into buildings that they have been blocked from going into. But one of the biggest areas that's undercounted, and actually it's the reason I first got involved in the census, because one of the areas that I work very deeply in is child care, daycare. And many of the child care advocates were coming to me talking about the great number of children who were missed and undercounted in 1990. I believe it was really the largest area of the undercount. And that, as we know, affects all types of planning and funding formulas. And I would like you to comment on those 2 points.
Yes, well, with respect to the undercount of the children, the odd thing is these are census forms that come back in. So it's not as if we haven't exhausted our procedures and gone to that household and gotten the census form, but we subsequently learn that children get left off of forms for all kinds of reasons. And one of the things that one of the major things that the corrected numbers do is to locate the percentage of kids who get left off forms and then add that number back to the census. Nothing more complicated than that.
But I'd like to add that in 1990, 70% of the people missed in the census were missed in households that were counted. And many of these were missed on forms, as you pointed out, that were returned by mail. But because of, I'd say, the tremendous amount of work that the Census Department has done and the local governments, we do have a tremendous improvement in the addressed list, and it's likely that the percentage will be higher in 2000, and will spending more time in the field going, doing the non-response follow-up, find these people if they did?
Well, we designed our processes under scrutiny, of course, of this Congress and the GAO to be prudent with taxpayer dollars. We could continue to knock on doors forever. We don't think that would improve the count materially. That is six attempts. Indeed, we have cases where we've gone back 12 times. That's out of procedures. That's more than expected to happen, but it does happen. We have very committed enumerators out there. So we do think at a certain point that you get data deterioration the further you move away from April 1st. You get memory problems, you get mover problems. And so it is our statistical judgment that the sooner we can get these data, the better. So it's not a rushed census, it's a higher quality census if we get the data closer to April 1st. But no, Mrs. Maloney, kind of just continuing to knock on doors, we have been met at the door with people with guns, as Mr. Souder knows. We have had physical and verbal abuse. We don't send people back 12 times when somebody says, if you come back here next time, it's going to get worse. We don't send them back. We do have to worry about the safety of the enumerator staff. So no, I think just kind of knocking on the same door that you've already knocked on half a dozen times will not necessarily improve the count. It will spend more money, a lot more money, and then we'll have a different set of hearings saying, why did you waste all that money going back after people told you they weren't going to do it?
And GAO produced a report that confirmed what you were saying, and I'd like to put that report in the record. But I would like to know from the chairman if he would consider having, I know my time is up, the next hearing with the Justice Department and the Voting Rights Division on why they made this decision. I would like to hear it myself. I think that that would be an appropriate forum for the members of Congress and the American public.
I'm certainly interested in finding that out, too. I think in July we're hoping to have 2 hearings. One, we're already talking with the Bureau with your revisit in July, but also to talk about the American Community Survey issue, and I think, which gets to the long form, but I think that certainly would be one would be of great interest. We'll continue now in the second round, and Mr. Souter then would be next. If could you let me make one clarification. Ms. Maloney was talking about the use of these adjusted. Now you use the word corrected, which I think that's a politically used term. I think it should be adjusted data. But and as you all will continue would say, is the aggregate that we're taught. When you use the aggregate, you know, we average out errors, basically. And the problem is that at the block level, we have error rates. And our argument is, and what the courts are looking at, is block level data. And how many people are in a block? What's the average, size of a block?
30 households.
30 households, all right. When you adjust a block and you've got to add this virtual person or delete a real person is where you get the high error rate. And redistricting is done at the block level. You add a block here, you add a block there, you take away a block there, and that's where you run into errors. Now, my understanding with the BLS, if you're talking about the population of the state of California, that's one thing. Or the state of New York, that's one thing. But we're talking about redistricting, which is block level data, and that has high degree of inaccuracy. Mr. Sal, thank you for yielding the time.
Now, I'd just like to note for the record, which I didn't bring up earlier, but I want to note for the record that part of this, first off, whichever party isn't in power in the executive branch is certainly going to call you up whether you spend too much money or less money or other kinds of things. That's kind of the way it works. That's what oversight is, by the way, too. And part of my frustration has been we're now griping about the end, partly because, I mean, I represent Fort Wayne, Indiana, and we've had a continuing battle. We can't even get the maps. The local person was still complaining just a couple of months ago that they didn't have the newly annexed areas of the city. They didn't have the correct maps. They were sending census workers out not where to go. We've battled this problem for roughly 2 years now. We also, and your Chicago director was very responsive, came down to meet with a lot of my urban pastors and leaders in the community who were very concerned about an undercount. In Fort Wayne's got 220,000 people roughly. We'll hopefully have a better count. Because the only place they advertised for census workers were out at 2 suburban libraries. I mean, we're sitting there knowing where our undercount's likely to be. We've had this influx, for one thing. I've learned through the Historic Society, not through the Census Bureau, that I now have the largest Burmese population in the United States because, and also we do immigration in our office, and because we have one of the dissident professors and 2 of the legislators, we've got this big influx. We've had a big, I know we're going to undercount the surge in Hispanic population in our area because we don't have any census people even out checking them. They should have gone immediately to the Catholic Church where many of these people go, but instead we're out in the suburbs. Now, so it was kind of like, now we're saying, well, we're going to have to adjust the count. Well, yeah, if we don't have the right maps and we don't have the right workers, we probably are going to have to do some adjustments in count. But understand, that's what leads to some of our not completely unjustified paranoia that we're being a little set up. Not necessarily on purpose, because you have a massive thing, but no matter how we argue it, that's what makes some of us paranoid. Now, I have another question, because non-responsiveness, the long form, short form, which the long form is so essential to information, but as somebody who got the long form, and also I want to praise one other part of your program, by going into the schools, my son then, as I was mad about getting the long form and complaining about the questions, my 12-year-old came over and said his teacher told him he was supposed to watch us fill it out. So I realized I had to kind of compromise my anger as I was going through the long form. But I can understand a lot of people who may not have had their son there at the moment, or who were even more upset about what they viewed as obtrusiveness. So we had, and then it's kind of blown into the media, led with other kinds of problems. But I have a letter here that I would like unanimous consent to insert into the record. It's from a Miss Carol Hugo. It's to her, a portfolio director from the regional director, and she's based in San Jose. And it has to do with gated communities. that the line that's in question here, and the code is cited that says if you're the owner, proprietor, manager, superintendent, or agent of any hotel, apartment house, boarding or lodging house, tenement, or other building, refuses or willfully neglects when requested by other officer or employee of the Department of Commerce, basically to furnish the names or occupants, but or give free ingress thereto and egress therefrom. But the line that's in question is, we anticipate that you will provide our census enumerators access to the apartment complexes, and then this line, and information to substantiate occupancy status as of April 1st. That led many of these type of communities to feel that that was an information request beyond access, because it potentially puts them into other information. And for those who rightfully or wrongfully are very concerned about government having all kinds of access to information, has opened up another can of worms and then led to information going around. Is this official policy that this can be requested, and if so, on what in the code?
Yeah. I want to make certain I give you a good answer on this, so I may want to write you afterwards. It certainly was not our intent to try to get Title 13, that is confidential data, in this manner. We have apartment complexes where, I visited one the other day, for example, where we hadn't gotten a response from Unit 101, 102, 103, and then 203, and then 306, and so forth. And I went with the enumerator. We went to that housing unit, that apartment complex. Well, 101, 102, 103 were storage bins. They had come in through our address file because they looked like addresses, but they were storage bins. My guess is that's what this intends to identify. Are there any units which are really not inhabitable units? But if it's more than that, I will certainly get back to you. But I'd prefer not to try to give you a complicated explanation. Our policy is not to give Title 13. We really protect the confidentiality data every step of the way.
And also, even if that's the intent, I would suggest that this type of wording scares people and leads to a lot of the problems, and then leads to non-response and leads us back into estimating. If I could have unanimous consent to ask one additional, this is another personal question. I had a questionnaire come both to my house in Indiana and to my apartment in Virginia, and then had a person knock on the door. And I took the time then to call back to tell that person, you know, I can't be counted both places. But it led me to just wonder about another thing here is, would I have been estimated?
No.
And adjusted? How would you have known that I was a congressman and already been counted in another place? And how many other people have dual?
The housing unit of the apartment where, I presume you responded back in your home
Yes,
home
that's
district.
where I was on
the housing unit that you said, it would have been coded like what we call seasonal housing. Lots of people have 2 or 3 housing units.
But how would it be recorded seasonal housing? The housing complex might not know.
Well, because when the form, it'll come back in ticked off seasonal housing. And so you will now, that housing unit will not be on our master address file.
I run it year-round.
What?
How, I'm wondering how. What?
How do you know it's seasonal?
How do you know it's
seasonal?
seasonal?
I mean, that's a code that we would use. You have 2 homes. One of those is your primary residence.
Right.
That's the one where you are counted. You have a second home that is not your primary residence. And so that will be taken off of the master address file. That's this huge operation we're about to do now in the field, going out to about
you cross-check
8 or 10 million houses back to cross-check.
You cross-check actual names, is what you're saying?
No, we wouldn't. Well,
how would you find
yes,
this?
We would. Well, because you didn't answer the form, right? You told the enumerator.
But if I hadn't called back, because most people I don't think is going to take the time to call back.
Well, we actually go back out to all of those housing units and try to determine whether they are, what their unit status is. That's our job. And sometimes we ask building managers, and they will say, well, that's somebody who primarily lives someplace else. This is a vacation home, and then that becomes ticked off that way. That's the operation that we're now about to engage in.
If I could just, I think what he's asking, what if he sent back both of them? How would you know which one was primary, which one was seasonal? I think
which is to say, if he decided to break the law, which of course he wouldn't.
Of course not, but if he decided to do that.
And they both came back in. We wouldn't find them. We won't find we can't match a response that comes in from Fort Wayne, a response that comes in from Virginia, wherever the department is, and we can't do that. That would be a fraudulent response. Actually, the accuracy and coverage evaluation system would find that case. find instances of that case, and we would then estimate the total number of those cases. That's what creates the overcount, people sending forms in from more than one house. And that's what that process is about, just like the undercount.
And I want to get back to my question, because there's no way, if I may just have a second, there's no way, because there's no way for anybody to identify that I'm seasonal, because I don't rent seasonally. I pay regular monthly rent. My apartment's in an urban area in Arlington, filled, and I'm wondering if after several visits, and they can't even find me. I mean, if I hadn't called back, because I just found, I happened to one time check my phone messages, I don't even usually do, because we're here late, you know, I commute back and forth, and I know in this particular complex that many do, not just congressmen, but people who are lobbyists will come in, their company may have an apartment under their name, and I'm wondering how those people, would they then be estimated based on the number of apartments, the number of people in the apartment? How would you pick up the fact that, let's say, the difference between me and somebody who just wasn't responding?
Yes. What the accuracy and coverage evaluation does, Mr. Souter, is it goes to 314,000 housing units across the country. We use a probe, we use a different interview instrument. We call it one which probes and probes and probes. We will go back to a sample of those kinds of units. That's what this is, a sample of those kinds of units. We will probe until we are certain what the characteristic of that household is. And if that is if the characteristic of that household is somebody who has a primary residence someplace else, but we got that response, that's what the statistical adjustment handles. That's what the whole purpose is. And we think it is a superior way than just leaving both of those records sitting there. As I go back to my opening comment, sir, a census is a series of operations that tries to get what is necessarily an estimate closer to the truth. And if we stop the census today, we would have an estimate. We think by additional operations, we can move that estimate closer. We do not think we can get to perfection. We do not think we can get to the identical number of people who live in this country on April 1st, 2000. It's a practically, it is an impractical kind of goal. So what we do is how close can we get the estimate to that truth? Could I take one more sentence on Mr. Souter? I want to be back on the political thing if I can, sir. I have thought about, read about, written about, feel very strongly about the kind of the way in which the decennial census has been caught up in a partisan battle. So I don't at all mean to suggest to you that I'm not paying attention to that. As an academic, I'm paying a lot of attention to that. I care deeply about it. Indeed, I've written an essay recently that tries to recommend some ways to get out of that. And it's counterintuitive. I don't think you'll get out of that by trying to get the Census Bureau kind of removed from politics. I think there is a way in which we can get the data collection removed from politics, but the application of the data will necessarily be political and legal. But what I'm concerned about is the politics are now about how we collect data, not how we use data. And that's what's not good for the society. We've got to be able to collect the data in as nonpartisan, independent fashion as possible, and then use the data in the political legal process. The Census Bureau is comfortable with that. We simply want to be able to collect the data using the best statistics that we know how to collect.
And what's extraordinary about the debate is you have a subcommittee chairman who's actually a statistician, a mathematician. I'm a business person, undergraduate and graduate, taken many statistics and operations research courses, done marketing research, and we're enamored of statistics. Anybody who, I mean, Tom studies statistics of every district in the country. He's a big believer in statistics. The irony is you have, arguably on our side, more people who are fascinated with statistics than sometimes on the other side. Ultimately, this is really a political debate of how statistics are used. Right. Figures lie, liars figure. It's one of the, that's the colloquialism, and that's what we have to watch doesn't happen.
Yes. Let me, Mr. Ford.
Sorry. Quickly, the only way I think we could do what you've said, Director Pruitt, is if we import Martians here who have no political history and no history of making contributions to anyone. You stated in your opening statement the Census Bureau has now completed well over 99% of the non-response follow-up workload nationally. We've completed non-response follow-up in 437 of the 520 local census offices and have completed 90% or more of the workload in all but 2 offices. Briefly, how does that compare to perhaps the last 2 or 3 censuses, your overall sort of performance, your operations, your department's overall performance?
Every major operation, Mr. Ford, has been superior to the ones we've done in 1980 and 1990. Does that mean perfection? No, but it is superior.
But we
are ahead of schedule.
It's an improvement. I congratulate you amidst all of what you've heard here. I think I speak on behalf of all of us in saying congratulations, and we hope you continue the good work. I would only make the point again about politics. I don't know how we avoid it. Mr. Davis, you're my friend. I certainly wouldn't suggest or cast aspersions on any of your questions, your motivations. The fact that you are chairman of a committee, its primary purpose, if not sole purpose, is to maintain the majority for your party in the Congress. I respect that. I have a chairman on my side, Patrick Kennedy. I know you and he have a good personal relationship. You disagree philosophically, but have a good personal relationship. I take you at your word when you say certain things. I can only hope that you would accord my side the same courtesy. And to my friend, Mrs. Souder, I mean, true, there may be folks on your side who have a greater interest and perhaps have had some experience in statistics more so than perhaps on our side. I don't know that. I'll take your word. Perhaps you've studied this. But I certainly don't think that gives you any more right. Just as I may say we visited more schools than you guys, so perhaps we're better experts on education than you are. I wouldn't dare say that. But I would hope at some point that the politics of this, we could divorce it a bit, and perhaps it's impossible to do that, and if that is the case, then we ought to state it. But I do find it interesting that the only people today talking about politics incessantly have been us. He hasn't mentioned it. Every question that we've raised with him, he's denied not only of having any political biases or prejudices, and I understand people bring that to any discussion, any debate, and any job they may have, as Mrs. Souder so accurately pointed out, but to suggest that he should have an answer to a decision made by the Department of Justice, I think it's somewhat asinine. I mean, I don't know why we would even question him repeatedly and almost badger him into giving us an answer as to what his thoughts are, what he would have us do. I mean, the court recently, no one accused the Conference Committee on Managed Care Reform of waiting for the Supreme Court to make a decision about whether or not you could sue HMOs. I wouldn't dare do that. The court has spoken. I would imagine that would influence what the Conference Committee does. We would have as many political reasons on this side as saying, look, you all are holding this up because you want the court to decide, and the majority of the court is Republican appointees. Therefore, they're not going to follow the law we want them to follow. They're going to follow the Republican law, and we'll get a Conference Committee report that favors Republicans. No one would dare suggest it. So I would hope at some point that we could seize this, and perhaps it'll take an election to do this, and the people will have an opportunity to speak on it as they do every 2, 4, 6 years nationally, and perhaps even more so locally. But I would hope that Mr. Pruitt knows we appreciate the work and you and your deputies and subordinates have done here in Washington and across the country. I salute the regional director that covers the state of Tennessee and certainly my district, the 9th in Memphis, Ms. Sue Hardy and others. You've done a great job in the face of withering attacks from us at times, sometimes justified, oftentimes unjustified. And I would only hope in the coming weeks that we can give you the support that you need to finish this job. And I'll work closely with Ms. Maloney, and I must say she has been a stalwart and a giant and a warrior on our side, ensuring that funding has been there, her and Mr. Miller both. But I did want to thank her and say, Mr. Pruitt, go back to work. We call you before this committee too many doggone times. Get us an accurate count so we can put us out all this talk about politics, apportion right, redistrict right, and Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Davis can go at it, and we can go at it politically here and see what happens in November. With that, I yield back, and I thank the director again.
Mr. Davis, you have
just a real quick question. I wanted to ask you on this final attempt at FOS procedures. Yes. A lot of attention is being paid to the pace with which the Bureau is completing its non-response follow-up workload, and I think you've reported the non-response follow-up is completed ahead of schedule in many cases. With no problems in staffing. Many officers report they've come in way under budget. I think that's great. But what I want to understand is the most difficult to count are in the last 5% of the non-response follow-up. And yet counting this last 5%, I've got something here, the final attempt procedures, where we're saying we want all final attempts must be completed within a matter of 3 to 4 days. What's the thinking behind that?
What happens, Mr. Davis, is that when we get to a certain point, which is to say roughly 95% of an area, every case, I do want to insist, every case gets the same treatment. That is, every case gets the full complement of visits. And what the final attempt is an organizational way to get all of the cases in the hands of your best enumerators. So we bring everyone in. We fire a lot of enumerators at that stage. We don't need them. We're down to those last few hard cases. And we simply reassign the workload. And then we use a blitz strategy, because our experience over the years suggests if we really blitz it and go after it, we will get more of those cases in. And not until we have finished that do we then go into what we call closeout procedures. And that's yet a different procedure after that. But every household gets all of those visits. No household is shortchanged. At a certain point, you do quit trying, because you've now been there, you've been there, you've been there, and I've gone and enumerated. I've had people tell me, I'm not going to answer this questionnaire. I don't care what you do and how often you come. Well, so we then go to other mechanisms to try to get the household count of that unit, and I can describe those.
I hate to close things, but rather than having to come back, I think we're ready to end the thing. So thank you again, once again. I think it's very important for this process that you have come forward up monthly, and you know it's not always the highlight of your day, maybe, or the week, but
but could I just
very briefly? And then
it's very brief, because I haven't had a chance to meet often with Mr. Sauter, Mr. Davis, but I have said it to you and Mrs. Maloney. I do hope that this subcommittee has a hearing sometime this fall, whenever, that addresses the big question of how to get the decennial census out of the kind of the political environment. I think it's very, very important. And it has not to do with these immediate operations, but it has to do with the larger, I think, health of the nation's number system. So I would urge that we look forward to that conversation.
I ask unanimous consent that all members and witnesses' written opening statements be included in the record without objection. So ordered. I would like to enter several recent pieces of correspondence from Director Pruitt to me regarding census operations in the record at the time without objection, as well as CRS legal analysis of the proposed regulation without objection. In case there are additional questions that members have for our witnesses, I ask you unanimous consent for the record to remain open for 2 weeks to members to submit questions for the record. Thank you again, Mr. Director Pruitt.
We just found out.
That's the one.
This weekend on our companion network, C-SPAN, live coverage of the Green Party National Nominating Convention. We'll be live Sunday starting at 11 a.m. Eastern with the convention's keynote address delivered by 1980 presidential candidate John Anderson.